I found the tunnel on a Thursday afternoon in April 1923, and I want to be precise about the day and the time because precision is what I have always brought to things that other people preferred to leave imprecise, and the discovery of that tunnel is exactly the kind of thing that benefits from precision, because imprecision is what allowed it to exist for 53 years without anyone who mattered knowing about it. 53 years. I have sat with that number across the 41 years since the discovery, and I have never once made it feel smaller by familiarity. 53 years of a passage running beneath the foundations of the Convent of St. Tekla in the village of Mrozie, 40 kilometers east of Warsaw, used for purposes that I will describe to you completely and without softening, because the truth of what that tunnel was used for does not deserve softening, and the people whose lives were taken through it do not deserve the false mercy of imprecise language. My name is Sister Józefina Radwańska, and I was 47 years old when I found it, and finding it cost me 2 years of my life in ways I will explain, and I would find it again without hesitation, because the alternative was leaving it unfound, and unfound things of that nature do not stay contained. They expand. They take more. They took enough. The convent of St. Tekla had been my home for 19 years by the spring of 1923. I had entered at 28, older than most novices, having spent my earlier years working as a surveyor's assistant in Warsaw, a profession that was unusual for a woman in 1900, in which I had entered through the particular combination of a father who believed daughters deserved technical education and an employer who cared more about accuracy than convention. I had spent 8 years walking the land around Warsaw with measuring equipment and notebooks, recording elevations and distances and the precise relationship between the surface of the earth and everything built upon it. I brought that knowledge into the convent the way I brought everything, completely and with the intention of using it. 19 years of convent life had not diminished the surveyor's habit of seeing the land beneath the building, rather than simply the building itself, of noticing when what was above ground did not correspond to what should be below it, of reading the surface for what it concealed. The convent sat on a slight elevation above the village of Mrozie, surrounded by old-growth forest on 3 sides and the village road on the fourth. It had been founded in 1870, and the building itself was solid and plain, the architecture of institutional faith rather than aesthetic ambition. The grounds covered approximately 3 hectares, including a kitchen garden, a small orchard, a cemetery where the sisters buried their own dead, and a series of outbuildings that had accumulated across the 53 years of the convent's existence. A woodshed, a root cellar, a stone storage building of uncertain original purpose that we used for preserves and dried goods. I had walked every centimeter of those grounds across 19 years, and I believed I knew them as well as I knew the prayers I said every morning before dawn. I was wrong about that in a specific and consequential way that I discovered on a Thursday afternoon in April when I was surveying the kitchen garden's drainage situation, which had been causing problems for 3 successive springs, and I noticed that the ground subsidence pattern in the southeast corner of the garden was inconsistent with what the soil composition and the drainage gradient should have produced. I want to explain why that inconsistency mattered, because it is the kind of observation that sounds technical and minor, and is in fact neither. When ground subsides, it subsides according to the nature of what is beneath it. Solid bedrock produces no subsidence. Uniform soil produces uniform, gradual subsidence. Voids produce irregular, localized subsidence, depressions that appear in specific locations rather than across a general area, depressions that deepen toward a central point if the void beneath them is elongated. What I was looking at in the southeast corner of the kitchen garden was a linear depression, subtle enough that anyone who was not specifically looking for ground anomalies would have attributed it to the drainage problem we were already investigating. It ran from the southeast corner of the garden in a northeast direction toward the old stone storage building, a distance of perhaps 22 meters, and the depression was deepest at the storage building end. I stood in that garden with my notebook, and I drew the line of it, and I measured the depth of the depression at 5 points along its length, and I knew, with the certainty that 19 years of not surveying and 8 years of surveying combined to produce, that there was a void beneath the ground I was standing on. A significant void, an elongated void that ran from somewhere beneath the kitchen garden to somewhere beneath or adjacent to the stone storage building. I did not tell anyone immediately. This is the decision I have examined most carefully across the 41 years since, the decision to investigate privately before bringing what I found to the Mother Superior or to the civil authorities, and I have justified it to myself in the following way, which I believe is honest rather than self-serving. I did not know what I had found. I knew I had found something. But the history of women who report anomalies to authorities before they have concrete evidence of what the anomaly means is a history of being dismissed, managed, and thanked for their concern in tones that convey the opposite of gratitude. I had been a surveyor's assistant for 8 years, and I knew that history intimately. I decided to find out what I was looking at before I told anyone what I was looking at, because concrete evidence survives dismissal in ways that anomalous suspicion does not. So I began investigating alone, on Thursday evenings when my duties permitted me time in the garden, and I did it with the systematic patience of a woman who had measured the land around Warsaw one precise increment at a time, and understood that accuracy requires slowness. The entrance to the tunnel was in the stone storage building. I found it on my third Thursday of investigation, in the third week of April, beneath the heavy wooden shelving unit on the eastern wall that held our winter preserves. The shelving unit had been there as long as anyone in the convent could remember, which is to say it predated the memory of every living sister, and it was attached to the wall with iron brackets that had been painted over so many times they had become continuous with the stone surface. But when I moved the preserves from the lower shelves and pressed my hands against the back wall and applied the kind of attention that a surveyor applies to a surface that may be concealing something, I found a hairline gap running in a rectangle approximately 80 centimeters wide and 140 centimeters tall. I found the mechanism that released it, an iron pin embedded in the mortar of the wall beside the shelving, on my next Thursday visit. The door, when it opened, swung inward on hinges that had been oiled recently. Not last month recently, not last year recently, weeks recently. The oil was fresh and clean and had not yet begun to accumulate the dust that accumulates on everything in old stone buildings. Someone had oiled those hinges within the past month. Someone who was still using this door. I stood in the storage building with the door open and the smell coming up from below hitting me with a force that was physical as much as olfactory, cold stone and earth, and something beneath those things, something that I identified with the part of my mind that had processed difficult information for 47 years without flinching, as the smell of organic decomposition in a confined space. I had smelled it before, in the early years of my convent life, when a small animal had died in the space between the chapel wall and the exterior stone, and the smell had a character to it that was unmistakable once you had encountered it. Something had decomposed in that tunnel. Something or multiple somethings. And the hinges had been oiled within the past month. I went back to my cell and I sat on the edge of my bed and I held my notebook in my hands and I thought about who in the village of Morosi had access to the convent grounds with sufficient regularity and unquestioned presence to use a door in our storage building without being noticed. The convent had 3 lay workers who came regularly. A man named Tomasz Wierzbicki who maintained the grounds and had done so for 11 years. A woman named Pani Dąbrowska, who helped in the laundry twice a week and had done so for 9 years, and a supplier named Józef Malinowski, who delivered flour and dry goods every second Tuesday, and who had been making that delivery since before I arrived at the convent 19 years earlier, which meant he had been delivering to St. Tekla since approximately 1904. I went to the Warsaw Civil Archive the following Monday, telling the Mother Superior that I needed to consult municipal drainage records for the garden survey, which was true in the way that the best covers are true. The Warsaw Civil Archive held records of missing persons reports from across the Mazovian region going back to the 1870s. I spent 6 hours there, and I came back to the convent with a notebook full of information that rearranged everything I thought I knew about the village I had lived in for 19 years. Between 1870 and 1923, 47 people had been reported missing in the area within a 40-kilometer radius of Morosi. This was not in itself remarkable for a 53-year period across a region that had experienced 2 wars and significant political upheaval. What was remarkable was the pattern when you plotted the disappearances against geography and timing. 23 of the 47 had last been seen in or near Morosi specifically, and the disappearances clustered in a pattern that had a periodicity to it. a rough regularity of approximately every 18 to 24 months that spoke not of random misfortune, but of something with a rhythm, something that operated on a schedule that had its own internal logic. I brought this to the convent's Mother Superior on a Friday morning in early May 1923. I brought my notebook, my measurements, my archive research, and the straightforward account of what I had found and what I believed it meant. Mother Superior Celestina was 63 years old and had been running the convent of St. Tekla for 22 years, and she was not a woman who wasted time on doubt when evidence was in front of her. She listened to everything I said without interrupting me once, which took 40 minutes, and when I finished, she asked me two questions. The first was whether I was certain about the freshness of the oil on the hinges. I told her I was as certain as 19 years of careful observation could make me. The second was whether I had touched anything in the tunnel. I told her I had not gone into the tunnel. She nodded and she stood and she said we would go to the civil authorities in Warsaw that afternoon, and we would bring my notebook and she would do the talking because she had a relationship with the Warsaw police commissioner that predated my arrival at the convent, and relationships, she said, are more efficient than evidence when you need someone to act quickly. She was right about that. The police investigation took 11 days. They entered the tunnel from the storage building with proper equipment and lighting, and they followed it for its full length, which was not 22 meters as the garden depression had suggested, but 114 meters, running beneath the convent grounds, beneath the forest at the eastern edge of the property, and emerging in a concealed exit behind a large boulder formation in the forest approximately 90 meters from the nearest road. Inside the tunnel, they found what the smell had told me they would find: remains in a chamber approximately 3 meters square that had been excavated from the surrounding earth approximately midway along the tunnel's length. The forensic examination, which was conducted by specialists brought from Warsaw, determined that the remains represented a minimum of 11 individuals and possibly as many as 15, and that the oldest remains were consistent with a date of deposition in the 1870s, and the most recent were no older than 18 months from the date of examination. Tomasz Wierzbicki, who had maintained the convent grounds for 11 years, was arrested on the 14th day of the investigation. The investigation subsequently determined that the tunnel had been constructed by his grandfather in approximately 1870, used by his grandfather, and then his father, and then Wierzbicki himself across a period of 53 years for the robbery and murder of travelers and itinerant workers who passed through the Morozi region, their bodies disposed of in the chamber that Wierzbicki accessed through the convent storage building, because the convent grounds, being religiously protected and socially unquestioned, provided the most secure and unexamined entry point available. He had maintained the convent grounds for 11 years specifically because the access it provided. He had maintained that access across 11 years of daily contact with the Sisters of St. Tekla, women he greeted every morning by name, women who trusted him with their garden and their orchard and the physical fabric of their home. Wierzbicki was tried in Warsaw in November 1923 and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison in 1941 during the German occupation, which means he died before the occupation could decide what to do with him, which is a fact I note without satisfaction, or its opposite. The tunnel was sealed by the civil authorities using poured concrete at both ends and at the chamber, a process I supervised personally because I was the one who had found it and because I did not trust that a job of that nature would be done with adequate thoroughness by people who had not spent 19 years walking those grounds and understanding what thorough meant in that specific context. The shelving unit in the storage building was removed and the doorway behind it was filled with new stone and mortar. The kitchen garden's drainage problem, which had been genuine all along, was resolved the following spring with a properly graded French drain that I designed and that has, to my knowledge, functioned without problem ever since. Some things you fix because they need fixing. Some things you find because they need finding. And sometimes the ground beneath you is telling you something that the surface has been concealing for 53 years, and the only question is whether you are paying the kind of attention that allows you to hear it.